All right, I want to welcome everybody this morning. Certainly, I believe I know everybody, but if I don't, my name is Paul Pratt, and I'm the rector here at Christ Episcopal Church. We are glad that you are here this morning for what I believe is a really important discussion. So I want to introduce our speaker, and Dr. Levine. I'm going to just go ahead and tell you, I got some of this off of the university's website, so it sounds kind of boilerplate, but it is what it is. Dr. Daniel Levine is an associate professor in the departments of political science and religious studies at the University of Alabama. His primary research interests are in international relations, international political theory, Middle Eastern politics, history and collective memory, and aesthetics. That is a mouthful. I'm paraphrasing here, and these are my words, but I believe that one of Dr. Levine's gifts is the ability to cross-pollinate between the religious and political worlds. We claim to desire separation of church and state, but that doesn't just seem possible given the world we now live in. Therefore, it becomes critically important to understand how one impacts and influences the other. We were recently asked as clergy about the possibility of arranging for a conversation. And knowing how polarizing this can be, it might have been easier just to sit this one out and avoid it. But for all sorts of reasons, I believe this is a conversation that we must be engaged in. Our desire is to present a balanced approach to what is currently taking place in the Middle East, particularly regarding Israel and Palestine, as well as the history that informs the current state of events. Obviously, there are a variety of opinions and views, and I certainly welcome those and your feedback. One of the things, though, that I love about our faith tradition is that we aspire to claim the via media, the middle way. I believe that gives us the unique vantage point of being able to look in both directions, and it is why our process of interpretation and discernment is based on Scripture, tradition, and reason, and it can be most helpful in moments such as this. I also believe that it demands of us that we listen as much or maybe even more than we speak, which is what we have come here to do today. We had hoped and we had tried to have another person join us, Dr. Waleed Hasboun, to share this time with Dr. Levine. He is a Palestinian, but he is currently in Qatar, I am told, and unable to join us, but we will make arrangements for him to come and speak to us at a later date. So I got Kathy Randall to ask Dr. Levine for a prayer to begin our time together, and he gave us this beautifully appropriate blessing. Blessed are you, O Lord our God, ruler of the universe, who gives of his wisdom to human beings. So it is that wisdom that we seek this day. And Dr. Levine, we are honored to have you here among us. So I give you Dr. Daniel Levine.
Can you hear me? Oh, no? Oh, yeah? Okay, splendid. Okay, will do. So thank you all very much indeed for the opportunity to be here. That blessing, now that I hear it said out loud, I guess that puts me in the role of the wisdom, and that is a humbling experience. I will try to make good on it, and I will leave that for you all to decide. There are maybe thank you also very much for the invitation and for the hospitality. It is these are difficult times, and one of the fun things about being a scholar is that one gets to sort of hole up in one's corner and look at books and kind of get into one's own head a little bit. There is a certain pleasure in that withdrawal, but it is important to remember when one studies politics that one is dealing with people who live in the world, and so the opportunity to speak in this way is a privilege. And so, Kathy, thank you very much indeed, and Reverend Pratt, very much. Maybe the best way to start with this, given this introduction, some of you may, actually probably not. Unlike most professors of Jewish studies, I have a particular Anglican bishop who I am absolutely enamored with. He lived in Jerusalem as a canon at the first part of the 20th century, and he executed the first intellectually rigorous translation of the Mishnah, of the oral law supposedly received by Moses from God at the same time as the 5 books of Moses. He did this partly at the time he was a young canon who had studied Hebrew and Middle Eastern languages. He did this in part because he wished to understand the gospel better, and at the time, and many still think, the Mishnah records some of the arguments that are also some of the arguments that become homiletics in the Gospels. But as he's doing this work, he also finds himself engaged in Jerusalem with the folks we would now call Israelis and Palestinians. And in the process, maybe discovers that there is, and the people who have sent him because they hope that he will win converts. And maybe he discovers over the course of his time that actually it's not about racking up converts so much as it is maybe about creating something new. After all, what is most complicated about the Old Testament is that it is also the Hebrew Bible, that those two things are kind of the same thing, but they also kind of aren't, because the reception traditions are very different, even if the books are more or less the same. That particular kind of intellectually prehensile way of thinking about texts, in which they are both what they are and how we receive them. Right? That the Hebrew Bible and the Old Testament are, in fact, the same thing, but in a sense also they are not. Right? Something like that is also the complexity that we need to master. Oh, louder? Okay, yeah, let me move it up a little more. I've never had a problem speaking loudly before. It must be the good influence.
It's church, lay it on.
There it is, there it is. Oh, I see, I should, yeah. Yeah, there is a tradition like that in Judaism too, it's just not the one I was raised in. Some of that complexity is part of what we have to bear in mind when we approach this conflict. It is very difficult to talk about, and it's very difficult to talk about well, because, well, there's no neutral language into which it can be decanted. Just as there is no third tradition, which the Old Testament folks and the Hebrew Bible folks could go like, you see that over there? That's the thing we can all agree on. Well, there isn't really one here either. This territory is both Palestine and it is Israel. It's a question of how it's received. It's a question of how it's lived. It's a question of how it's thought. And that is very difficult to wrap your head around. Now, when I say that it is both of those things, I don't wish to make the suggestion that I'm saying that there are somehow two things in one. What I'm trying to say instead is that the narrative about the land and the way that different communities live in it can't really be separated from one another. Right? If you were to start reading the Hebrew Bible as I was trained to read the Hebrew Bible, you would be doing the Hebrew Bible differently. And it might get you in trouble with the pastor, right? And so it is here as well. If we wanted to think in more scientific terms, the thing about carbon or coal or, I don't know, Canada geese, is they don't really get mad if you call them something other than what they think they are. You're not denying them. They don't require recognition to be, they don't feel the lack of recognition as a harm to them. And so, like, we can argue about, when chemists argue about what carbon is, it doesn't really matter if one of them wants to call it something else. There's no moral problem there. There's no ethical or political problem there because carbon doesn't care. By contrast, here, the language is bound up in the conflict. And so to say this is something and not something else, if I say, well, how did Israel get into all this trouble and what is it going to do now? Or, well, you see, you must understand, it's Palestine, right, from the river to the sea. I'm invoking a whole set of complicated political arrangements, which I either then have to give an accounting for, if I'm going to be terribly honest and rigorous, or I have to hope you won't catch me out on it and you'll just follow me along such that by 10 or 15 minutes in, you won't have remembered how I started and that went, wait a minute, why did he call it that? And how did that connect? And maybe if I'm super lucky, you'll kind of forget about that whole thing, and before you know it, you've kind of bought into the thing I'm selling. Put differently then, the problem here is, I think I used that phrase essentially contested before. If I didn't, I'll use it now. That this is a technical term of art, and it means an argument in which there is no way to talk about the thing without also taking a position in it, because there is no neutral language into which it can be decanted. And that makes things complicated. If we were medieval theologians, it would actually be easier, because there were a lot of things that those folks didn't know. They didn't know how fire worked. They didn't know how gravity worked. They didn't know why some people got the Black Plague and some people didn't. And because they didn't know those things, they had to use a lot of judgment a lot of the time. They couldn't resolve things through science. We have a community, we have a society that's actually, when we can, we try to take all those essentially contested difficulties and resolve them by figuring out what they are really. Then we don't have to argue about them anymore. If I can turn an irresolvable metaphysical problem into a scientific problem, well, it's not really the Black Plague, it's really this, it's really that. Oh, okay, well then I don't have to. But for those few things where you can't, you have to break out the judgment. And judgment is tough, because everybody judges things differently. That's why we all take seriously who's sitting on the Supreme Court, because a bunch of different, very honest, very intelligent, very highly educated people can judge the same text differently. As we know, because the Old Testament is not in fact the Hebrew Bible, despite the fact that it is. So that's sort of big problem one. And I'm aware, I know that folks have to get to church, which is the actual business of Sunday morning, so I'm going to try to keep this to sort of 20 to 25 minutes so that there's plenty of time for questions. So I'm just trying to be mindful of that. But that's sort of big problem number one. Big problem number two. Oh yeah, it's really not working, huh? Wow, I just did that whole thing on essential contested and nobody heard it, huh?
No, they did. They did.
Okay. Okay, well, belts and suspenders.
Let's pump up the volume.
All right, belts and suspenders. It is on.
Yes.
All right, belts and suspenders. Okay, so when we talk about Israel, we're sometimes talking about this particular piece of territory. Sometimes we're talking about this state, which came into being in 1948. Sometimes we're talking about a community of faith and practice. Sometimes we're talking about a faith community that mostly believes things in private, the way that the separation of church and state encourages us to do. Other times we mean something like a collective community of faith. And Jews/Israelis are not themselves entirely, there's no consensus within Judaism as to which of those meanings is correct all of the time. Similarly, if I use the term Palestine, I'm sometimes referring to the Roman colony. I'm sometimes referring to a British mandated territory that was created after World War I. I'm sometimes referring to a kind of notional historical territory. People would speak of Palestine in the 18th century the way that people might nowadays speak of the South, right? A kind of notional geographic space that defines a particular culture, a particular accent, a particular set of foods, a particular political legacy, but doesn't have clear borders. There's no embassy of the South that you can go to, not since 1865. And really where it starts and where it stops, so it's notional. Sometimes we're referring to those parts of the historic land of Israel/Palestine, which were supposed to be a state for Palestinian people when the United Nations agreed in the 1940s that that historic land should be divided up into two states. And sometimes we mean both the land and the people. So people speak of Palestine now as a kind of nation half in diaspora and half not, in a way that people 70 years ago would have spoken about Israel as a nation both half in diaspora and half not. And now this brings one last further complexity. For those of us, and I'm now speaking, when I say us, those of us who speak sympathetically about the creation of Israel, do we mean something that happened when we speak of the modern Israeli state? That state that was created in 1948 as a result of a decision by the United Nations and a war. When we speak of that state, are we speaking about something that happened to Jews in the diaspora? Or do we mean, or are we talking about something that happened to the diaspora itself? Let me unpack what I mean by this. There is a very old story in Jewish faith and practice that goes something like this. There was this covenant between this fellow Abraham and this all-powerful God. There was a covenant between the parts. There was a promise about a particular land and a particular people, and about how the people would inherit the land. That covenant takes a couple of centuries to work its way through history. Egypt, Exodus, Joshua, conquest, judges, prophets, kings. And the story goes, well, you know, the Lord was pretty clear with us as to the stuff we were supposed to do and the stuff we were supposed to not do. We didn't always do it as well as we were supposed to. And the consequence was that our political, temporal control over that territory was taken away, and that we live in diaspora as a result of that. That it was the fate of Jews. This is the moment when Israelites, if you like, become Jews. It is their fate to be ruled by foreign kings until such time as Messianic redemption comes. Question: when the modern Israeli state was it created to solve that problem? Or was it created to solve a much more immediate problem? Modern anti-Semitism, the politicization of modern anti-Semitism, mass destruction, world war, genocide. The incompatibility of Jews as a national minority in a European system of states within which that national minority had no real, clear, comfortable, or defined place. If we say that the Israeli state exists to solve that problem, well, I mean, that's a human problem. That's why people like Rowan Williams will say, well, you know, as a leading Christian theologian, I need to think about how my theology works because I might be implicated in that somehow. And that's something I can do because I'm a theologian. Like, I'm a human being who reads God's word, and I try to parse it as carefully and as intelligently as I can. If I say, on the other hand, pardon me, that the Israeli state ended the diaspora, or began a process by which the diaspora was ending, then I'm speaking less, if you like, to an Episcopalian audience and more to Pastor Hagee's portion of the room. And that's a very, very different, what's the word I'm looking for? Kettle of fish? Because if the Israeli state is meant to solve that problem, then David Ben-Gurion, Benjamin Netanyahu, and the various ministers of that state are King Solomon 2.0 or 3.0, King David 2.0 or 3.0, Rehoboam 2.0, 3.0. You go back through the book of Chronicles and Kings and you'll find all the secondary, right? Or, you know, he's a guy who won an election with whom we can disagree. The stakes there are very, very high, and there is a subtle shift in the terms of discourse that has taken place. In 2017, the Prime Minister of the Israeli state compared the President of the United States to Cyrus the Great, because the US had moved its embassy from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem. I don't actually care whether you agree with that or not. I do care very much that you understand what's at stake when someone makes a statement like that. Because Cyrus the Great, after all, is the fellow that made Ezra and Nehemiah and the restoration of the temple possible. And that wasn't simply a political event, that was a theological event. Were it not so, the destruction of that same temple in 70 AD by the Romans would not have been the end of something, a divine rule on earth. Now again, we don't have to agree on what the divine rule in 70 AD meant and what its ending meant. And we don't even necessarily have to agree on whether or not President Trump was a modern-day Cyrus the Great. But I do think that we need to be attentive to the question of what's at stake in that question so that you know where you come down. Because remember before when I said that there's a way in which that language gets used and you kind of get drawn up into it, and before you know it, you're talking that way and you didn't even realize you were talking that way or what you were invoking? My guess is that David Ben-Gurion would have been pretty surprised to be compared to Ezra or Nehemiah, good socialist that he was. Although, by the end of his life, his views on that had changed. Growing up in the tradition that I grew up in, I would have felt that was, I don't know, hubristic? You know, but on the other hand, David Ben-Gurion might say, well, for you it is hubristic, but for me, like, look at this movement I helped create and look at what the consequence was. Maybe I do know something that y'all don't know. Go back to your ancient Greek. Oedipus wouldn't have been an interesting story if Oedipus wasn't head and shoulders above everybody else. So yeah, he was hubristic, but you know, he came by his pride honestly. At all events, that's what's at stake here. When we talk about this, we have to decide whether or not we mean a modern political conflict that exists essentially within a human world of action, interest, power, belief, or whether we are acting out a story in which we are players but not authors. And you are absolutely free and absolutely entitled to pick either one or to write something else. I like to say in class when I give lessons like this that that a lectern is not a pulpit, and that maybe this is a pulpit. I'm actually not sure which one this is, but you all didn't ask me here because I have a degree in divinity, right? So what I would say is, first and foremost, if the problem number one that makes this conflict difficult to talk about is that terminology is contested, problem number two is that the way in which it's contested will sometimes make you feel like if you don't talk about Israel and Palestine this way, you're a terrible Jew, or you're a terrible Christian, or you're a terrible Muslim, or you have betrayed your tribe, or you have betrayed the one who loved you, or you will lose your grace. And I don't know whether that's true or not. That's not a question I can, I don't know, I want to use the word in Hebrew, lifsok, which means to rule in a rabbinical sense. Like it's kosher, it's not kosher, right? I don't have that degree. I have a PhD, right? So don't listen to me when I make those rulings, because my authority does not go there. What I can say as a political philosopher is those arguments are at stake here. And so when you feel that tug, other times I might talk to you and it will offend you. Wait a minute, well, the Israelis, they're bombing a hospital, they're doing this. Wait a minute, I read Adam Smith and John Stuart Mill in high school. I read all those things. Like, that offends me. That offends my sense of liberalism and fair play. That offends my sense of, right, and those times someone's talking to you and you feel like a citizen, rather less than a believer. And so now you're not going to get in trouble with the pastor, you're going to get in trouble with the Pledge of Allegiance, with the promise of American freedom, with America as a pluralistic society. And those rhetorics are at work all the time. And it's hard to know when you're stepping, where you're stepping. Even those of us who talk about this stuff for a living have difficulty making sure that we're stepping where we need to be stepping. So what that means is you should probably cut yourself some slack. Because the fact that those things are hard to talk about well isn't anyone's fault. It just is what it is. And the whole point of judgment is that it's fallible and that people get to make mistakes. So if you're not sure how to talk about this, that's okay. You're allowed. Even those of us who talk about it for a living don't always know how to talk about it. What we can say more clearly than others can perhaps is why that thing I just laid out is as fraught as it is, but I can't make it less fraught. I can't solve it scientifically. Aha, you see, it's not as real as Palestine, it's really carbon, and therefore it's as simple to solve as the carbon problem. If I could do that, that would be awesome. That would be the political science equivalent of turning water into wine, I suppose. Second reason why this is difficult, and this one's much shorter and much easier. It is often difficult, especially when confronted with the extremity of violence that we have seen over the last month. It is difficult sometimes not to feel the call to stand with someone. The thing about standing with people is you then have to sort of be okay with the stuff that they do and judge the stuff that the other guys do a little bit differently. That's what loyalty is. So that's allowed too. And those are ethical choices, and it's not my place to prescribe which ethical choice is the right one. What I can say is that most of the time, well, actually, let me restate that. What I can say is that we often fail to give patience and prudence and caution their due dignity. We actually don't need to name the thing right now. We don't necessarily need to say who we stand with right now. To withhold until you know, or like you feel that you can know, is not necessarily a betrayal of one's loyalty to one side or the other, or a tacit acceptance of violence to one side or the other. It is difficult, but it is possible to feel the pain one feels when one sees these things, and yet not to want to give it the simple name that tells you what it is, tells you what its relationship is to you, and therefore who you're going to stand with and who you're going to write the check to, and what you then have to do to feel okay with yourself. It is okay to dwell in that in-between space. I'm up to 25 minutes, and so I'm going to stop here, except that I will say this. I will quote Canon Danby and his translation. One of the books he translated was a book of the Mishnah called The Ethics of the Fathers, the Pirkei Avot, which is unlike the rest of the Mishnah, which is broadly a series of legal principles. The Ethics of the Fathers is an ethical text about what it's like to live a godly life and what the work of living a godly life is. And in that translation, one of the little epigrams, little nuggets of wisdom you get, is that one should be as quick to fulfill a commandment that is small. Remember, we're talking about Jews, right? So commandments are super important. And one should be as quick to observe a commandment that is small as one should to observe a commandment that is large, because one commandment carries the next one in its train. Each commandment that you carry out makes the next one easier. But each transgression makes the next transgression easier. Well, I didn't really keep kosher so well this week, and Yahweh didn't punish me, so maybe next week I'll, actually go the full ham sandwich. Each one makes the next one easier. But also, don't expect the divine to reward you for this thing, for the wage of one commandment is simply the next, and the wage of a transgression is simply the next. There is no reward for the right thing other than that it is the right thing. The reward here, there will be, I have a teenage child. Telling him that I kind of want to withhold judgment on some stuff that he sees on TV and feels strongly about. Like, Dad, you need to, be brave, get a grip. And I'm like, yeah, I understand. I understand that it would make me popular. with you and your friends, but like, those are not the wages I'm after. And prudence is part of what I'm called to do. And that wage is its own wage. And that can be true here too. So if we don't quite know what to call the thing we're looking at, like, don't worry. Because that stuff will out. And we will have that time. And in the meantime, there are things we can do that will help the least of us, and I think all of us feel called to try to do that. And that actually is fairly straightforward work. I'll stop it there and let the questions, rather than try to anticipate questions, or tax your patience further. Sir?
I think most Americans are concerned about the amount of anti-Semitism that was played by college universities.
Just repeat the question.
Oh, sure. The gentleman asked if, he pointed out correctly that many Americans are concerned about anti-Semitism on American campuses, and asked if I wished to comment on it. There are good reasons to be concerned. There are very good reasons to be concerned. Part of how this conflict is structured is that it tends to bring out everybody's basest impulses and worst instincts. And those dynamics have a centrifugal quality. What I mean by that is they both make the middle weaker at the expense of the margins, and they gather up momentum. So as rhetoric gets more anti-Semitic, it becomes easier for rhetoric to get even more anti-Semitic. And then it also permits people to make all sorts of other kinds of racist arguments as well. So it opens up a window for a kind of, so I'm very concerned by it. It hasn't happened much at UA, and for this I am grateful. I'm actually teaching the Israel-Palestine conflict this semester. My students are kind of the heroes. They get that this is something big, scary, and important, and they don't expect it to confirm their simplest worldviews, and they actually kind of just want to study it, which is kind of awesome. And I'm proud and grateful. If I were at Columbia or Cornell, I don't know how I'd feel. I was trained at schools like that, and some of the schools that I was trained at had events like that. What I will say as well, if I'm honest though, is that there is as much ambient, there is as much ambient racism against Arabs and Muslims in this country and in our political discourse as there is against Jews. Now, there is certainly the case that the last 2 generations of our political culture, the experience of the Second World War, the lived memory of it among those who live and remember it, forced certain kinds of confrontations that even if they weren't successful, they at least got people thinking that maybe they should speak more carefully about Jews and the particular form of difference that Jews manifest. And that memory, as that generation is no longer with us, is come to something else. And I'm very worried about that. But it is also the case that we live in a different time, and part of what makes this moment distinctive relative to that one is that Jews have a state, and actually Jews have a state with an army that's well equipped and well trained. I know because I was in it. I was actually one of the not very good soldiers. I was more on the Gomer Pyle side than the Rambo side, but I saw those guys, and that's something that we didn't have in the 1930s. And that is sometimes a source of comfort, but it's also a cause, at least for me, for concern, because with power comes a kind of responsibility, and we also, as Jews, haven't really had to deal with that responsibility for a long time either. And that is very difficult. So I'm very much concerned by it, but I am very much concerned by it, yes. Please.
20 years ago, I was at Tel Aviv University, and the consensus among the Israelis there was that there was no need to address the concerns of the Palestinians because the Arabs didn't care about it, didn't care about them.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Do you think a two-state solution is still possible given all the settlements that have been built and the
Yeah.
willingness of the Jewish state to give up East Jerusalem to Palestinians for their capital?
Thank you for that question. I would love to talk to you about that after. Let me say two things, because I think there's two pieces to that question. I do think that both the Zionist movement, and by the Zionist movement I mean that organized political, ideological collective that believes that Jews should have their own national state the way that other people have their own national state, that Judaism is a nationality the way that Frenchness is a nationality, and that just like the French people have the right to be ruled by other French people on a territory of their own, so too. Part of what has roiled the Zionist movement from the beginning is this question of what Echad Ha'am called the weighty question, right? The fact that there is another people in that land now. And whether or not their national claim is an authentic one, whether or not their national claim obliges us to abridge our own merely by the moral weight of it, or only as a geopolitical problem. I think part of why we are seeing the violence we're seeing now is because we tend to view Palestinian demands primarily through the prism of geopolitics. And since Palestinians are weak, we, okay, we'll make deals with the Saudis. We'll do this, we'll do this, we'll do this. And now the question of like, well, but what about a viable territory for a Palestinian state so that Palestinians can have their own rights? And the answer is, well, they lost the war. Sorry, not sorry. And, the thing about moral rights is they don't disappear as existential facts simply because the people entrusted with carrying out those rights politically, entrusting and caring for them politically, do a bad job at it. And so the fact that folks were saying that 20 years ago is a problem. And the fact that we did not get to a two-state solution in the wake of the diplomatic process that was kind of crashing into a wall 20 years ago is part of that as well. So I don't know whether I think a two-state solution is possible now or not. It would require, I think, for the Palestinian national movement to make a decision about Zionism that, like, yeah, we may not like it, but it's a fact, and so they get to have part of the historic homeland whether I like it or not. And I don't know that that decision has been unilaterally and unequivocally taken by every corner of Palestinian nationalism. And I'm not sure if it has by Zionism either. And so really the viability of any two-state solution, I think, ultimately comes down to legitimacy. And legitimacy only happens if you say something like, yes, I recognize the existence of a moral right by this other nationality, whether I like it or not. And therefore, I don't get to have all of my historic homeland. Otherwise, what do you salve for the loss of the homeland? Think about it in terms of Quebec, right? If the Quebecois weren't able to sort of point to Ottawa and say, like, yeah, okay, they may be English, but like they seem like nice people. And they're certainly doing well by us. And it's not like we could really, it's not like we have money to burn on embassies and armies and all this stuff, because we're kind of small and rural and not much of an economy, so like maybe by and large, so like, yeah, I mean, we would love to be our own sovereign state, but probably not in this life. And hey, Ottawa's pretty good. That way of balancing legitimacy against interest is part of the calculus that we engage in. And that only works if that legitimacy is there. And so I do think a two-state solution is possible, but I think a two-state solution is possible only if a critical mass of Israelis and a critical mass of Palestinians want it. And I will say one more thing about this, because I think that actually a critical mass of Israelis do want it. Part of how the Israeli constitutional system works, it makes it very, very difficult for the executive branch to do stuff. Part of why, those of you who've watched Prime Minister Netanyahu, he's got a certain self-assurance, a certain brusqueness that's meant to convey, like, if I say it, it will happen. That sort of performance of strength is primarily due to the fact that his coalition sits on a knife's edge, and the Israeli constitution actually encourages the margins at the expense of the center and encourages extremism at the expense of common sense. And that's not Bibi's fault necessarily, but everybody who watches Israeli politics has known that for a very long time, and we have not really ever addressed it effectively. And we can't expect Palestinians to pay that price forever. At least not if we want to have what you're talking about, a two-state solution. There much more to say about that. What I will say, by the way, everything I just said probably cuts off emotionally about a week before everything we just saw. I have no idea how anyone in Israel could see the stuff they saw and not have 68 different kinds of PTSD from it, and that's going to make compromise much harder. And what is going on in Gaza now is several orders of magnitude greater than that. And those are the people with whom that peace will have to be made. So I don't know. I hope so. Sir. I think, no and yes. I don't think that, because I know we're getting close to time, I don't see the media environment changing anytime soon. I think that we used to talk about the manufacture of consent and the manufacture of certainty. Now what we're really dealing with is the opposite. Like, we have a political system that has figured out a profit model for the production of non-knowledge, the production of insecurity, of epistemic non-knowledge, confusion. And so far, Elon Musk hasn't made any money at it, but he's good at making money, and so he will figure it out. And when he does, it will only get worse. I don't think that's going to change. When I said at the beginning, this is one of those moments where you need the judgment, that's why you need it, right? Because, you know what? Suppose the Palestinian Red Crescent Society is inflating the number of, forgive me for being blunt, is inflating the number of dead Palestinian children by 50%. Suppose that's true. That's still a lot. That's still a lot of the least to me. And I know whether or not I'm actually literally called to account in this life or the next, I know that morally I will be called to account for it somehow. And so, like, I would love to be able to say, like, yes, I've dug it up, and here's what really happened under Shifa Hospital, here's the tunnels. But, like, suppose that story's only half true. Like, what does that cash out in terms of the number of dead civilians we're willing to accept? And so too with the Israelis, right? I mean, again, like, let's not forget that also was, right? Like, so, I mean, the Israeli state just downgraded the number of people from 14 to 12, and they did that because they had time to count, right? But, like, oh good, well, it was only 1,200. Right, I mean, that's nonsense. So I think that's why, when I said at the beginning, like, we need the judgment back, that's why we need it. It's good that you're a church, right? Because churches, Faith traditions are part of what revealed texts are for, is to help us puzzle through kind of the given mysteries of the human condition. We are entering into an era which, though it is highly technically mediated, it brings new forms of existential insecurity that are, in a way, much closer to the world of St. Thomas than to the world of Albert Schweitzer.
What does your faith inform you as to what is the morally right thing as to whether or not be a two-state solution?
The question is, what does my faith call me to? So I realized one of my notes at the beginning was I'm not representing the University of Alabama or the United States or the Israeli state or an embassy. I'm only representing myself, and now I'm reminded of that because you've asked me what I feel. So I will tell you, but I will also tell you that the fact that I have a PhD and studied this for a really long time is in no way, those degrees don't endorse that. We're now speaking about sort of what I feel, and what one feels is what one feels, right? So the fact that I feel this and that I'm your guest, doesn't mean that you're obliged. And only under those terms can I answer it, because otherwise I'm creating a misunderstanding as to what kind of intellectual authority I bring. Tel Aviv is the only city that has ever really been my home. And one does not give up one's home easily. And so I have certain feelings about this state, this polity, this place, and it is very hard for me to imagine a world after the two-state solution. The fact remains, that I might have to. But I remain hopeful. But I think I remain hopeful the way that my grandfather was hopeful in the coming of Mashiach, the coming of Messiah, right? What he used to tell me was it's winter, button your coat. Yes, he's coming, but still button your coat. He might not be coming before the bus comes. You should probably protect yourself against cold weather. And that kind of faith, it has a political consequence, but it has very little epistemic authority behind it. We all know people who that one event happened and they never could quite live in the world again. I wonder if my faith about the two-state solution means that, my students, one nice thing about teaching undergraduates is that they'll always say, oh yeah, the old guys, they can't really, they can never get over it, right? Maybe my students are saying that about me right now, that I'm sort of hopelessly, the way that people our age talk about, the Cold War, and our kids are sure. Yeah, that thing that you always go on about. Yeah, I kind of maybe wonder. That's the most honest answer I can give you. Ma'am? If that's all right?
Go ahead. No.
Well, is it true that, with regard to the two-state solution, is it true that the West Bank was kind of becoming an informal Palestinian state, but Prime Minister Netanyahu had encouraged Jewish settlements in the West Bank?
Yes, those Israelis who embarked on the peace negotiations in the 1990s that we call the Oslo-Madrid negotiations, that was predicated on the idea that the territories that Israel captured in the war in 1967, the West Bank and Gaza, would be the territory of a future Palestinian state. A territory that's considerably smaller than what the UN had sketched out in 1949. That is true, and that the Likud party, well before Mr. Netanyahu, but certainly including Mr. Netanyahu, have encouraged settlements in the West Bank precisely to foil that, because they don't want that to happen. That is also true. That's why I said, these two national movements have not completely decided whether or not, right? Because if there's going to be a Palestinian state, it has to be somewhere. If there's going to be an Israeli state, it has to be somewhere, right? So. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
My pleasure.